It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Islands at War. Myself, Keith Pengelly, and also with
Nick Lahure. Hi, Keith.
Hi, Nick. So, yes, April 1942, an immense amount of material to get through in this episode, incredible amount. Usually we start off with food. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't do that today. This is from the diaries of Herbie Winterflood. The Guernsey Brewery put a 2p deposit on bottles in order to promote the care of bottles. Customers were urged not to break or contaminate bottles. So there was a real shortage of glass. Any sort of utilitarian implement like this really needed to be taken care of in a way we wouldn't think about today.
Yeah, absolutely. And down to Larish were asking, bring your shopping bags back. Don't be just, expecting to get a new one from us. But yeah, it's just difficulty in obtaining things.
Of course, the other thing is that they didn't have plastic in those days, which we have now. Yeah. So, people, I think, to agree, forget that. Okay, Raymond Fuller, who was the agricultural officer for the Guernsey government, agricultural officer for the Guernsey government, issued some information regarding crops, vegetables grown in gardens where German troops were billeted. Now, this is interesting, Nick, because he was saying, they decreed that if the crop had been planted by the house owner, then the crop belonged to him or her. This is with the view that a German soldier or military had been billeted upon a house. However, if the crop had been planted whilst German servicemen were billeted in the house, then a mutual agreement would have to be reached as to the sharing of the crop. So we could have planted potatoes here in this house or in this garden. A German comes along whilst they're growing in the ground. Those potatoes would have been mine. But if they were planted when he was here, they would have been shared out.
Yeah. And of course, the reason that this is important is because people were getting moved around. You never knew if you were going to have your house taken over, particularly if you had a nice townhouse. They were very fond, the officers were very fond of that looks like, I quite like the look of that one, and trying to find a reason to take it over for their own billet. And as well, initially they crammed some of the men into houses, perhaps more than they needed to.
I think if it had been me, I'd like to have thought I'd have it more now. So instead of looking at the house, I'd have probably looked at the garden to see if there was any food in it.
So you could have, you merrily planted your potatoes and then two weeks later been kicked out before you'd had a chance to, grow your crop.
Yeah, well, it does say here that if when agreement could not be reached, then the parties needed to contact the billeting officer who would try and resolve any problems. Was the billeting officer, Nick, to your knowledge, been a part of the government or a German arbiter?
Yeah, I think they're talking about billeting officer as in a German.
Yeah, so we wonder, well, we can only speculate on how he would have decided things. And I think you've also got something here, a sad tale from one of your unpublished diaries.
Yeah, this is from Ambrose Robin. I spent the whole day up at the Prio Library the other day having a look through this diary. It's a fascinating one, which we've talked about before. But Robin's got a bit of a sad entry, really, and it's all to do with food. Unfortunately, his dog Tim is not very well, so he calls. He's a bit reluctant to call the vet because he's a bit worried about what the vet might say. So he calls the vet, Eustace Lene, who says, well, we'll see how he's in a few days, sort of thing. And then eventually he decides that he's going to have to potentially part with his chum, as he says. And this is all down to food. So the dog is ill because he's not able to feed it the right food or enough. And the problem that he's got is there was a friendly Austrian who had lived nearby who basically was giving meat to the dog. And that Austrian had left the island. He'd been transferred somewhere else. So that supply of meat for the dog had gone out the window, as it were. And what Robin finds particularly hard to bear is that this wouldn't have been a problem in normal times. He would have been able to feed the dog properly. So he takes the painful decision to in his words, part with another chum.
Yes, and he talks here about burying him was a miserable experience. Under present conditions, there was no other alternative. Sorrow is aggravated by anger and annoyance. Yeah, quite heart-wrenching, really. Again, something that people had to put up with, the sort of thing that we wouldn't ordinarily think about the occupation. All these little things add up, don't they, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a probable rumour, this one, Nick. A man, Guernseyman waiting in the market to be served, said to the shopkeeper, "You had better serve this German soldier before me." And the shopkeeper replied that he would serve him, the Guernseyman first, and that the German wouldn't know because he wouldn't understand. And then the German said in an American accent, "That's all right, I don't mind, go ahead." The soldier said he'd been born and brought up in America, but had been forced into the German army when visiting his German grandfather in Germany. It's not too uncommon, this, I don't think.
No. Some people are really surprised by this, but it wasn't that uncommon that those expat Germans that were living in the US or wherever, if they went to visit on holiday in 1938 or 39, they were quite often prevented from leaving Germany and made to join the forces. So that was a real problem for them. You know, they faced significant challenges if they were caught in the country when the war broke out as well. So there were, several accounts of Germans just like this one in Guernsey. So it's quite probable that, it could be a rumour or it could have been true.
Yeah. Well, this does surface in Band of Brothers, where there's an episode, or there's an occurrence in one of the episodes where one of the German soldiers suddenly sort of asks for a cigarette or says thank you for a cigarette and has an American accent.
Yeah.
And that sort of highlighted it. I think it was quite universally accepted that a lot of the people fighting for the Germans weren't there voluntarily.
Yeah.
Okay, now the other thing that hose into view, and I think you've got something from Robin's diary, is that the doctors in Guernsey are signifying that there are so many people dying now of what was termed occupational malnutrition. One of our diarists reports that there were up to 80 cases in the emergency hospital. The Germans objected to that name, but the local doctors insisted on it. One being Dr. Cambridge, who I actually remember in the 60s. He was our family doctor. I think wasn't there some sort of tension around what was signed off on the death certificates?
Yeah, there was. They really didn't like it being put down as malnutrition. I can't remember what I have seen.
Pneumonia, I think, was used a lot, or heart failure.
Heart failure was quite a common one. That sort of thing. But they didn't like anything that centered around, exhaustion, malnutrition, anything like that was not popular with the Germans, unsurprisingly.
No, well, I lost two great-grandfathers to malnutrition, or starvation, as my gran called it, in 1944. And later this year, next month, when the archives become available, I'm hoping that the death certificates will become available online. I might be able to see exactly what was put down on their death certificates.
Yeah, absolutely. You should be able to see those. I mean, Robin talks about how serious things have got by April 42, because he notes in his diary, he's actually responsible. I think it's the equivalent of the Social Security Department that he worked for, and they'd been forced to take over the Friendly Society, so the foresters, etc., got shut down by the Germans because they didn't like anything that was any form of association or any type of gathering of people, and of course the foresters still does provide health insurance, etc.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things he brings up there, which is something you just wouldn't have thought about, is hernias were prevalent because people just didn't have the strength and were exerting themselves and causing, this sort of type of strain on their body. Again, it's something that is a bit arcane, but it was a reality.
But he had this report and he was looking at it, the main points of it. The report that he was handed the previous day showed among the 3,000 odd members of friendly societies now under my control, there have been 40% more days of medically certified sickness this winter than the previous one. So that's over the winter of 42 versus the winter of 41, and sick least by 62%. That just shows how bad things were. And going back to, I think we may have mentioned in the March episode, or certainly in the February one, the difficulties with obtaining medical equipment and drugs, etc., and even simple things like bandages. And he notes that this report also indicates that persons injured and drawing accident benefits now take a week longer to recover than in pre-war days, in spite of the fact that the general run of the injuries are much less serious. But and a massive increase in hernias. In pre-war years, 6 per annum. In the past 9 months, we've had 41 cases, 5 of which were strangulated, requiring an immediate operation. I certainly wouldn't have wanted an operation during the occupation.
Really gruesome statistic. And it's also reported that local doctors wanted to appeal to Red Cross. So this is April 1942, so already relatively early in the occupation. Local doctors wanted to appeal to the Red Cross for food, but German doctors were afraid of Berlin, who take the line that everything is in the most satisfying condition. So really, it was a case of this not leaking out to the authorities in Berlin and presumably causing some sort of upsets around the Hague Convention, Geneva Convention.
Yeah.
Hague Convention, I think, more was civilian. Would that be right?
Well, a bit of both. Hague and Geneva Convention.
Okay, our friend Colonel Nakfus, restricting the use of motor vehicles on Sundays, exemptions for repairs to essential services. So who would have been driving around at that time? Was most of the cars have been taken away, I'd have thought.
Yeah, not many people were driving around, but certain categories of people did still have access to a vehicle, albeit they had very severely rationed, poor quality German petrol, which was, generally speaking, was kind of not petrol. It was a sort of mix of various...
Ersatz petrol.
Yeah, it was like petrol substitute, or whatever you want to call it, ersatz petrol. So it was pretty poor quality in any case. But you had the likes of doctors, the air raid, the ARP was still having gone through a period of being taken over by the Germans. They then came back into existence, and Lesotho actually notes in Jersey that because he was an ARP warden, he basically had to give up his motorcycle, which he notes that he doesn't mind too much because actually since the last time it was serviced, it's not been running very well, so he doesn't think the Germans are going to get much use out of it.
Our friend Reverend Ord is recording that professional prostitutes were now living in Hopeville. Not sure where the amateur ones lived. And would that have been the infamous green shutters? This is something that, even when I was a child, the family mentioned it as a place of ill repute.
Well, there was one down by where Credit Suisse building is along the seafront. I'm not sure about in Hopeville, but who knows?
I thought Hopeville, that's where I always heard that it was, someplace up near Victor Hugo's house.
Quite possibly, yeah. It's not an aspect of the occupation that I've looked into in detail, to be fair.
No, quite. And then we often quote from the Guernsey Press, but this time the Star. The Star had instituted a Help the Children Fund to relieve distress in families with tight incomes. So even at that time, there was a lot of charity work being done, a recognition that some people were suffering far more than others.
And that fund goes on to raise money throughout the rest of the occupation. They have a lot of fundraising activities, which, given how people's incomes were restricted, I think that's amazing, the amount of money that they actually managed to raise throughout the occupation.
Yeah, but raising, I don't wish to be negative at all, but you can raise all the money in the world, there ain't no food to buy.
No, I know that there is that problem, but it was just, I think, able to help. They did things like put on Christmas parties of a sort,
exactly,
and things like that for the kids
to raise the spirits and the morale just as much as fill the bellies.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, another probable rumour, and as you pointed out, Nick, it could have been being April, could have been April Fool's joke, but we hear a diary entry from Violet Carey out towards the airport to the forest. A German soldier was going on leave, but the day before he left, he received an oven-ready chicken from his wife back in Germany. It had all been readied to just go straight into the oven, but because he was going on leave to see his wife, he gave the chicken to his 3 friends, his comrades in arms. When he returned from leave, he reported himself to his commanding officer as he admitted to having murdered his wife and her lover whilst he was on leave. The officer asked him who had sent him the chicken. I shouldn't laugh. The soldier replied that it had been his wife. The officer then informed him that his friends who had eaten the chicken had died of poisoning. Now, I've looked up the deaths of this. Simon Hamill, there's a number of publications, Simon's is very good. It lists all the German fatalities and deaths throughout the occupation. And if you look at April 1942, you can't find any unexplained deaths there. So I just thought it was an entertaining example of theatrical rumouring.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an article called Rumours, Lies and Why. Some of this was people just had too much time on their hands and no real news. So, rumours started, so and so. I've got it on good authority is always how a lot of these start out. And some of them are rumours that are started because people are kind of hopeful that something's going to happen. So you see a lot of rumours about we're going to be liberated, or I've heard
the Germans are leaving.
The Germans are all going to leave on Monday, or stuff like this, and that's just people kind of trying to keep their hopes up, I think, and wishing for things. So you've got that sort of thing. Then you've got rumours that are started probably just to annoy the Germans more than anything else. You've also got the Germans starting rumours just to try and keep things, keep people under control, and perhaps not, start a rumour about, what might have happened to somebody or might happen to somebody, just to prevent that sort of event from happening. And it's no coincidence that you go and look at some of the things that were going on, and they're publishing notices banning things, etc. You'll quite often find that at some point during the same month, if they've published a bunch of notices banning you from doing things, that you'll find some, I can think of one example where, to do with, there'd been an act of sabotage or broken phone lines. Now, whether it was sabotage or not is a slightly moot point, because they were perhaps not the best at laying their phone lines from time to time. So there is some speculation in this particular instance that it was a cow that probably accidentally broke the phone line that was running across the field. But so they were publishing notices in the paper saying, severe punishment for any acts of damage to German property, etc. And it's no coincidence that on the same page you've got a report of an unfortunate gentleman who was a carpenter who lived in Normandy, and he'd been convicted of sabotage and shot. And they've clearly that's not particularly relevant news for people in the Channel Islands. But if you put it in the context of, we're printing all these warnings about what we're going to do if you misbehave, and this is what's happened to a chap in Normandy who's broken our rules.
I've got talking about people breaking rules and things. I've got something for you, which I don't think I shared it with you. I got it from Simon Delarue this week. Do you recall? Was it last month or was it in February 42? We spoke about this child that had been getting into lots and lots of trouble.
Yeah,
he had been birched by the police and carried on getting into trouble. In any event, where this all led to, that in court he was sentenced to go into a correctional facility in Jersey, and he broke down. And of course, we didn't know the child's name because the child was too young to be named. He was only 13.
I remember
that.
Us talking about
well,
it.
Simon sent me something which I thought he'd shared with you, but I think he might have just sent it to me because of sensitivity. But it turns out that he's found a newspaper report about this. And yes, the child wasn't mentioned, but it turns out that his brother, who wasn't a juvenile, had got into trouble and had received some of this stolen property, and his name was Stanley Pengelly.
Oh, there we go.
So we can deduce that the little sod was a Pengelly. I've looked up our family records, of course, and found no Stanleys.
No.
So I can confidently tell everybody that this little angel was not part of my family. So I haven't told you. It was only because I remembered it. We were talking about that. Leading on to far more serious incidents, it remains controversial to this very day, but the police scandal which we first raised yesterday, or you spoke about, last month, Nick, this came to a sort of culmination. In fact, that the trial the sentencing was handed out towards the end of April. You just talk us through this. It is quite complex, and as I say, there's a degree of sensitivity which I know that you're very aware of.
Yeah, and we're going to also put together a special on this, because there are so many aspects of it. It is a complicated topic, but it's worth us talking about now in terms of what happened. So there were basically 18 policemen put on trial, and this was on the 22nd of April. So, they'd had about a month between being arrested and being on trial. Ambrose Robin says he peeped into the police court once or twice during the day, and he noted that the royal coat of arms was obscured by the Nazi flag. And he said, I wished I could have stayed longer, as I was interested in the procedure, which is totally different lines from ours, because this is the German court, as it were. He said, the opening was laborious, and some of the questions were, to his mind, prejudicial to the interests of the accused. So it sort of sets the tone for it. It's not perhaps the fairest of trials. And the next day, on the Friday the 24th, he records what happened to the policeman. So the sentences were announced first thing on that Friday morning. And Harper, known as the managing director, because of allegedly supervising these activities, got 4.5 years. Smith and Quinn got 4 years. Tuck and Friend 3.5. Short 3.5. Burton 3 years. Duckman 2.5 years. Bailey 2 years 8 months. Ware got 2.5 years. Godion 2 years 4 months. Howlett 2 years. Pising 1 year, Leliva and Legally 8 months, Brettel 4 weeks, and Tardif 1.5 years. And Sergeant Ernest Pill was acquitted.
But this is something that the ringleaders had instituted before the occupation, as I understand it. This corruption, did it start before the occupation?
Not something that I've heard.
Okay, so like I say, we'll do a special on this, because it is a sort of a grey area. What we know that there are facts, the sentencing and etc., but there are mitigating circumstances. Not all of the policemen were as guilty as other policemen in terms of morality. I think it's something that we need to dig deeper into. There's
so many complicated aspects to this. As I say, I think we need to do a special, and I've got a couple of people that I know would be able to talk on the subject, both from a legal perspective,
yes,
and from a historical perspective, as in terms of what actually happened. The sentencing is just. I've seen various accounts where they're just somewhat bemused by. Yeah, okay, people get that those that were seen to be organising this and heavily involved in it got a longer sentence, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of sense between how somebody ends up with the sentence that they got in comparison to others.
And the Germans, of course, were employing methods of interrogation that wouldn't be allowed now. They were beating people up, basically.
Oh, yeah, of course they were.
Yeah, and so people were giving evidence under duress. So we'll undertake to do a special.
We will do a special on that. It might take a little while to put it together because it is quite a complicated area. Now, the news of Guernsey's police force all being replaced, which I probably should touch on as well, is the Guernsey police force, of course. What do you do when all your policemen have been locked up, bar a couple of them? You've got a bit of a problem, haven't you? And you certainly didn't want the Germans to just be the only police force in town. So they actually advertised in the Guernsey press for police officers, and by the end of April they had sufficient volunteers come forward to take on the role as police officers. But over in Jersey, Lesotho has actually heard of the fact that all of Guernsey's police force have been replaced because they've been involved in a black market racket. And he makes some interesting observations. He says much the same would happen here if the truth ever became public. But then, if nominal justice was done, there would be few of the 70,000 in the Channel Islands out of jail. He talks about another big case of the racket is being worked up here.
Being Jersey.
Yeah, being Jersey. And several well-known people have been arrested and many others are shaking in their shoes.
Was he referring to anything that has come to light since? I mean, he seems to be reluctant to actually note down what he's talking about. I mean, is it something specific that came to light?
I'm not sure. I haven't got that far through his diary, so I'll have a look. I mean, there were various prosecutions in Jersey for black marketeering, etc. I mean, he makes another valid point about, because we must remember Lesotho's not averse to a little bit of
hyperbole,
helping him. Black market. He'll go and buy stuff on the black market if he needs it. And he does make an interesting observation about this. He says the occupation seems to have brought out the worst traits in most people, and that all sorts of hitherto law-abiding citizens were being arrested for various offences. And for many of those, it was black market offences, which he considers under the present circumstances to be no disgrace for being arrested for carrying out black market activity. What he does take umbrage with, and many people do, is it's not the black market activity, i.e., getting around the rules and maybe getting a bit of extra food or whatever. It's the people who are profiteering out of that. That's the bit that he's narked at. And also some of the cases he considers to be jumped up. I mean, he talks about an OT labourer. Now, this is one of the paid OT labourers, not
OT being organisation Todd.
Yeah. Having helped himself to some cooked potatoes from the kitchen where he's working. Now, you're forbidden from supplying them with food, but these guys were only given 2 bowls of soup and less than half a pound of bread a day. But they had big wages in comparison to the locals, which, they were quite often then trying to buy food off of people and things like that, and get into an awful lot of people would get into an awful lot of trouble, including shopkeepers, etc. Lesotho notes that a well-known grocer is under arrest for replacing half the sugar supplied to him for jam making with saccharin and water. The sugar thus saved, netting him much more money than he would have out of selling the jam. Lesotho's got another interesting thing. I don't not come across this, and I must look at this a bit more. But in Jersey, there was a chap who was growing potatoes and crops, and there was particularly poor harvest from those crops, and he was arrested and charged with sabotage by the Germans for neglecting the crops. Fined 1,000 marks, which was about 100 quid at the time.
Yes, an odd sort of view on sabotage, a deliberate neglection of crops. You you can't see why someone would do that. There was, but the Germans have thought to make it a crime.
You're starving. You're not really going to do that deliberately, are you?
Exactly.
Unless you knew the crop was exclusively going to the Germans. Why would you?
Yeah, exactly. Or we are aware that people settled scores with one another during the occupation, and there could have been some of that. But that would have been a crime in itself. So that's not sabotage. That would have been just a straight out crime.
Yeah, he's got another interesting bit as well, which I hadn't come across before, where he talks about the latest evidence of Jerry's flair for regimentation are forms which each householder must fill in, giving details of each occupant. One copy to be sent in and the other fixed inside the front door of the property. And he assumes that the object of this is if there's a British landing, then accidentally or otherwise, so being sheltered by somebody, they've got a list of who should be in that house and who shouldn't be there.
Doesn't seem very efficient to me. I mean, it's on the surface it's efficient, but I can't see it really mitigating against anything that they were worried about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were busy.
Regulations for regulation's sake.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of that went on.
Yeah.
It's just one of the things they liked paperwork. And just with him alluding to British landing accidentally or on purpose, the Germans were still very twitchy in April 42, thinking that there was potentially going to be an attempt to take back the islands. So they were busy rolling out lots of barbed wire, etc.
Okay, now a little while ago we were contacted by Andy in Canberra in Australia, who is a fan of our podcast. Thank you very much. But he sent in some background of a relative of his, and we'll just put this into some perspective. Andy's, some time ago he wrote in, I'll read what he said. In April 1941, we're talking about his grandmother's eventual husband, Werner Rang. Werner was a doctor, and Werner had been promoted to Lance Corporal. He was transferred to an infantry division, infantry regiment, and eventually ended up in the Channel Islands. And in summer or April 1942, Werner was transferred to Sark to carry out an inventory of the medical supplies. This is where he met Andy's nan, Phyllis Baker, who was a local girl who took German lessons at school through the occupation. The German doctor on Sark required a translator, as Werner was the medical NCO who accompanied the doctor. Phyllis and Werner then met and carried out duties attending to the people of Sark for medical ailments. Now, Andy sent us a fantastic trove of photographs recently, and you've been in touch with Andy just today, I believe.
Yeah, I have indeed. Well, I exchanged emails with Andy Krieber about the story of Werner and Phyllis, and I said, look, for a bit of context, I said, actually, I met Werner numerous times.
You yourself, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. He lived post-war. He ended up living in Sark with Phyllis, and there's a whole story which you'll be able to listen to because Andy very kindly agreed to record an interview which I did this morning. With Andy being in Canberra, we ended up with us doing it at 8 o'clock this morning. But he tells the whole story brilliantly, actually, and it's a story very well worth telling. There's some unusual things in there. So Werner was a medic rather than a doctor.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Now he was sent over in April 42. It's quite possible that one of the reasons that he was sent over is the next topic that we're going to talk about. But just so you know, the special with Andy will be out. Well, depending on if you're listening to this podcast when it comes out on Monday, the 3rd of March, then it will be out on the following Friday. Or it may, if you're catching up, you may already be able to listen to it on there. But that's a really interesting chat with Andy. So thank you very much, Andy, for that. And we talked about it this morning, but those photographs there's some brilliant stuff there.
Yeah, so as Nick mentions, if you can, this program goes out on GNet Radio at 7 p.m. on every other Monday. and also then migrates various platforms. You already know this because you're listening to, but bear in mind, of course, that GNet Radio has a plethora of interesting music programs. We've got a new website. There's a listen again facility. So there might be much in our musical menus that you may enjoy. So I have shows there. We have my colleagues Simon Charlwood and Martin Tolcher, Patrick Devaney, covering off music perhaps off the beaten track and not like listening to any other musical station. No adverts, just quality music. Do you listen to our music from time to time?
I don't have time, Keith. I'm too busy.
Well, that's honest, Nick.
I'm really. I do. Well, actually, that's not quite true because I've edited the odd one now and again for you. So I have listened then, but
a multitask, Nick.
It's just doing so much other stuff. I mean, this is the third recording this week that I'm involved in, and I've got recording an interview later on from a book with a lady whose his father escaped from Guernsey, and they've got some tapes of him talking about his escape, which they're going to let me listen to. So yeah, I've just been so hectic that
I know.
I must confess,
we're not complaining.
We've got lots of other interesting stuff coming up in the future as well. So
I'm on BBC Tomorrow Radio Guernsey and Jersey talking about lighthouses with Jim Delbridge.
Yeah, I was on last Sunday with Jim, and as always, although the topic was a different bit of history, I still managed to get World War II in there because there was a World War II connection.
Well, was it last week that you mentioned the island of Chaucy?
Yeah.
Well, I shall be talking about another French Channel island tomorrow.
Excellent.
Yeah, so
good.
Tune in to find out, as they say. I'll have to tell Nick afterwards because he doesn't listen to my programmes. So. Okay, right, enough of our silliness. Back to
a slightly more serious topic.
Very much more. And in fact, we remain on the island of Sark because, as Nick alluded to, Werner possibly went over to Sark in the wake of the murder of a German doctor on Sark, the murder of Dr. August Goebel. Quite a big subject, Nick. Can I hand over to you?
Yeah, sure. So one of the diarists noted, I can't remember which one now, noticed that Goebel was, different to Goebbels. He noted that it would have been a much more welcome news if it had been Dr. Goebbels had been murdered in Sark. But let's just rewind a little bit. So Dr. August Goebel was the doctor based in Sark, and he lived in a property not too far away from the mill in Sark. Now, he was quite a good-looking chap, and he had his assistant was a little bit jealous of him because of his romantic liaisons, shall we say.
This being another German military chap. Yep.
Yeah. So basically, the doctor caught this guy steaming open his post, basically, because he was reading his letters, and basically gave him a severe talking to, and that you'll be for the high jump if I catch you doing that again. Then what happened was this chap murdered the doctor with a golf club, and then tried to stitch up one of the other Germans and made it look like suicide by chucking him down a well at the property.
Yes, I mean, it'd be very difficult to sort of pin suicide on the guy if he wouldn't have beaten himself with a golf club.
No.
So it was the throwing down of
another German down the well to make him look like he'd obviously been the perpetrator of the murder and therefore then killed himself afterwards, sort of thing.
But did the chap that committed the murder, did he then go on leave to Germany?
He ended up getting posted back to Germany.
Posted back?
Yeah. This is later on. This went on for ages, the investigation into it.
And it was investigated by German sort of CID, I think, because particular detective.
No, they arrested the wrong man to start off with. So, but the reason that this chap killed him was that basically the good doctor had somebody on the go in France, wife back home, somebody on the go in Guernsey potentially, and possibly somebody in Sark as well. And so he was just jealous of him. Now, they arrested the wrong person for the murder, who then there was a right of appeal to Hitler in this sort of case, and it was deemed serious enough that a German detective was sent from Berlin, who came and investigated and discovered who the real perpetrator was, and that was that. Now, I won't ruin it, but that was a very quick canter through it. Tim Osborne, one of the tour guides here, does a couple of tours to Sark a year, and he's got a whole host of information on this and tells the story in much more in depth. And obviously, you've got the added benefit of being able to see the property that he's talking about and things like that. So Tim does a really good tour around Sark, and that's part of it. So if you want to find out more, that's probably a good way of doing it.
Well, maybe we should invite Tim maybe to come on and do a special, because it was quite a subject, and it has some convolutions, but one hesitates to say it's entertaining, but it's an interesting story. Maybe we should get Tim, see if he'll come on and discuss it in more detail. What do you say, Nick?
Yeah, I'm sure we can sort something out.
Okay, I've got Winterflood here, Herbie Winterflood. The Guernsey Press printed a photograph of a group of POWs in an East Prussian prison camp. So the German authorities are presumably forcing the local media to disseminate propaganda, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It has no connection to Guernsey. They just make the local paper
they just
circulate this.
You end up with all sorts of garbage in the Guernsey Press because of it. Usually over the front page, sometimes strays onto page 2. But it's some of the stuff that they get them to publish is just very odd. They go through earlier on in the occupation. You know, you're getting a tour through Germany, for example, where they just publish random photographs from Germany. You know, the odd Schloss here and there, or rivers and things like that. And it's just like
a travel log.
It is, and it's on the front.
For your holiday next year.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, you too could be deported here. No, it shows much nicer places than where people ended up getting deported to for internment. You know, it shows nice rivers, flowing through scenic scenes, and it's
people must overhear reading it.
It's just very odd, and
shaking their head in bewilderment.
Yeah, exactly, And then, of course, then there's all the propaganda about, Britain's losing and all this kind of stuff going on. Or the Americans, and how wonderful the Japanese are when they enter the war. All makes the paper.
Okay. Now, we have a new diarist that hoves into view. Became a very important diarist, a chap called Louis Guillemette. Louis was the liaison officer, I suppose you could say, civilian. He was a career civil servant, very senior civil servant, and he was the liaison between Guernsey's controlling committee. The controlling committee was the reduced government here on Guernsey. He was the liaison between that and the field commentator, the German authorities, military and otherwise. And his diary, recently published, is a treasure trove. He was a man right on the spot, Nick, and one of the first things he did was describe the departure of quite an interesting gentleman. I'll leave you to pronounce his name. He was a member of the German aristocracy. He was a senior military figure here, but quite a decent chap. And could you take us through the... I'm really looking forward to you pronouncing the name, Nick.
Yes, he is. Thanks for that one. Yeah,
you're going to take a run at it?
We'll give this a whirl. First, von Ottingen Wallerstein. Probably. Apologies if anybody shares those names. And he was from probably one of the oldest aristocratic families in Germany. They had a long history dating back over 900 years. Produced some notable figures in German history. Now, he served as a German military officer. Unsurprisingly, that's how he ended up in Guernsey. And he was involved in overseeing the military tribunals and court cases, particularly, obviously, the one that we've just talked about in April 42, the trial of the police officers. But he himself had an interesting life. In February 33, he was sent by Crown Prince, oh God, I've got to pronounce another name here, Ruprecht,
I think that is,
something like that, to Reich President von Hindenburg in the course of the attempts to restore the Bavarian monarchy in order to prevent the rise of the Nazis, and so preventing the National Socialists from taking power. But he was rebuffed, unfortunately, for him and for everybody else, to be fair. But he worked in military administration in France during that time and was island commander for a couple of years in Guernsey. But he was called away from the island, and one of the accounts that I've seen suggests that the reason for this was he was sent to the Eastern Front, and it was because he was regarded by some in the Nazi Party as an undesirable. But he had an accident on the Eastern Front, and luckily for him, he didn't die, but he was severely enough injured that he was discharged from military service.
Yeah, so he was here up till April 1942. Then he, as you say, gets assigned to the Eastern Front, discharged from military at the end of 1942. Now, I mean, he was a serious German aristocrat, as you say. Now, it's quite probable, had he remained in the military, he'd have been caught up in the July 1944 bomb plot against it. I mean, this is speculation, of course, but this is exactly the sort of person that would have been, how should we say, sympathetic to a sort of overthrow of the Nazi regime in order to try and promote some sort of peace deal with the Allies, conditional peace deal with the Allies. And he goes on to be a founding member of the Bavarian Party. He lived quite a ripe old age.
Yeah, and he was elected to the German government in 1952. 1959, he got the Bavarian Order of Merit. I mean, he's got a horse race, named after him in Munich. So, and that race still goes on today. I checked, but yeah, he died aged 84 in October 1969. And Guillemette, describes him as a capable diplomat.
And he was known as the Prince.
Yeah, and he says he actually quite enjoyed the times that he had to go and see him because he was actually a reasonable chap by the sounds of it.
Yes, Guillemette writes that the Prince, as he called him, that he had a lively sense of humour, and this made him so like our people that Louis himself often enjoyed his interviews with him, as you say. So he somewhat enters our podcast and leaves, but at least he managed to survive the Eastern Front. Guillemette also writes, Nick, of talking with the bailiff of Guernsey about eradicating any misunderstandings or misunderstandings with the government of Jersey. So what sort of led to there being some sort of apparent misunderstanding between the two governments?
I'm not really sure at that.
Because he doesn't give any details at this point.
Because he doesn't give any details at this point about exactly what these issues are. The Germans typically tried to play the islands off against each other, so it could have been something related to that. There were always difficulties in terms of, there were some instances where we borrowed food or goods from Jersey, and the other way round, where we sometimes had stuff that they didn't have enough of, so there'd be exchanges of things. But it was difficult. I mean, there was communication between the islands, but obviously it was somewhat hindered by what was going on. So I'm not sure what the exact issue here.
I think things will come to light as we meander through the diaries.
I mean, one of the things that because Louis only started writing his diary, this point of the occupation. He was the man on the phone at the start of the demilitarization of the islands, with the negotiations between the government here and the government in the UK. So he was he was the chap in the room who was on the end of the phone to Whitehall, relaying messages from between what was said in the room and what was being said in London. That must have been A, not a very easy job, and B, a fascinating bit of history to be involved in, although it probably didn't feel like it.
Yeah, and I noted that Louis' entry for the 30th of April, he writes about continuing to work on landscaping features in his garden and then stopping to hear the 6 o'clock news on the BBC, so they still have radios at this point. And Louis was listening to an account of RAF raids on the north coast of Brittany, and he ruminates as he's working on his garden that he's going about his business in a very, very innocent way, but everyone really was living with the threat of, as he calls it, instant annihilation, constantly hanging over society. With what we saw in the White House last night, something we can sympathise with at the moment. I actually walked past Louis' house yesterday morning. In the last couple of days, apart from a shower this morning, it's been wonderful weather, Nick. And Louis out of his front window, the house is much changed, but it's still there. Absolutely fantastic view over Bordeaux, out towards islands of Sark and Herm, and out to the French coast. A remarkable place to have lived. And in fact, Louis' daughter, Josie, who's still with us, been very ill, so we send our best to her, of course.
Yeah. I mean, it must have been quite intimidating for him, though, because there was a point during the occupation where there was a machine gun position across the road.
Yeah. As one does.
Yeah. Now, it was there, obviously, to cover the beach and the roads around there, because there's a junction there. So that would have been why it was there, but it can't have been very nice having that across the road from your house, particularly when you're, an official in government.
And the reason I was walking around yesterday is putting a tour together for that.
Excellent.
From that area. But okay, we take a piece now from the Channel Island Occupation Society Review, number 20, number 20 was some time ago, Nick, but written by Ken Tuff. It's about the very unfortunate case of the Jewish ladies that were deported from Guernsey on the 21st of April. 3 Jewish ladies were deported from Guernsey, probably to St. Malo and then on to Rennes. Then Paris, they were deported from Paris to Auschwitz and believed to have been murdered on the 23rd of July. And I think we should name them, Nick.
Yeah.
There was Therese Steiner, a nanny hired by an English family who evacuated. Therese was interned in Fort Richmond and then transferred to the Cattle Country Hospital, where she worked as a nurse, and she was 26. Auguste Spitz worked as a ward nurse at the Cattle Country Hospital. She was 41. Marianne Grunfeld was a farm worker who was exhorted by her employer to evacuate, but left it too late, and she died at Auschwitz at the age of 30. We do not forget these people, Nick, and there is a plaque in their memory down at
the White Rock.
At the White Rock, at our docks here, port area in Guernsey. And in fact, Nick, at the house that Therese Steiner worked at as a natty is just across the field from here. I'll point it out to you when you leave. It's literally just as we speak, less than a quarter of a mile away across the fields. Okay, so we're very nearly towards the end of the program, and if you want to get in touch with us, as people do, Andy in particular, then you can get hold of us at occupied@gnetradio.com. Any queries, anything at all, we're always so pleased, aren't we, Nick, to hear from people.
Absolutely. You might have a bit of information that we desperately need
you may not know it, but it's
to fill in the. You might not think it's very important, but it might fill in the blanks for us on something, or help solve a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, so any anecdote at all, as I say, people do get in touch, and we've had some wonderful emails and even a few gifts. How's your Island Fortress blog getting on?
It's a bit quiet at the moment.
Why is that, Nick?
I'm concentrating on the book. I'm really pleased that the archives are reopening on Monday, because there's some stuff that I need to get from there, which unfortunately.
So for new listeners, the book is about people that escaped just from Guernsey, or
no, it's all
right
of the
through the Channel Islands.
Yeah. And now, obviously, I'm not going to cover absolutely every escape attempt. That would be an exceedingly lengthy tome. But what I am looking at is some of the more interesting escapes or attempted escapes. So yeah, that's and I was about to say the problem. The problem in inverted commas is, as I've gone through this, looking at, because there was a book written about Jersey escapes, which just covers some of them very, very briefly. But there's never been any book written about the escapes from Guernsey. There was an escape from Alderney as well. Nobody had ever written about those. So I thought, well, that's fine. I've got a list of all the people that escaped. Yeah, that list wasn't complete. As I've found as I've been delving through the National Archives in the UK, the Island Archives here, the Priaulx Library. Just the other day, I was looking at some old copies of the Guernsey Press. On there, they've got the wartime ones on microfiche that you can look at up at the Priaulx Library. So there's a wonderful facility up there. I was looking at something there, and it's just like, oh Lord, I think there might have been another escape. It's really odd because it's not mentioned by any of the diarists. But yeah, I think I might have found something that indicates.
Well, I had some good news as well. I had an email putting me in touch with the Fitzwilliam department at Cambridge University, and the wartime diaries of Elsie Henderson, who was an artist who was resident on the island. She was married to the French consul, Baron de Coudenhove. Those are going to be made available to us at the Priaulx Library. And it's another very, very rich diary that we'll be able to delve into. And you just know that on the day that you publish your book, Nick, we'll get the news of another escaping. That's the way. The cookie crumbles.
It's quite. I mean, trying to track some of them down has been quite difficult. I've got one which, rather annoyingly, I can't prove who they were. I've got some potential evidence, but not enough to make sure that it's actually the same people.
Oh, well.
But there we go. And I've even been in communication with some relatives of those individuals, and they're not sure either whether quite if the story that's attached to these documents relates to their relative or not, or whether it just happened to be around the same time, etc. And it's a little bit frustrating, but there we go.
So when's the publishing deadline, just for the listeners?
I had to ask for an extension because of the archives being closed up.
In time for Christmas?
Oh God, yeah. It's got to be.
That's Christmas 1942. Christmas 2025.
No, it will be out before then. So,
and you've got a lecture coming up soon at the Channel Island Occupation Society. Yeah,
I'm talking about a couple of the more interesting escapes.
Have you got a date for that?
That's 2 weeks today, so it
is
14th. Is that 14th?
Something like that. Yeah,
that's up at the Villette.
At the Villette Hotel. Yeah, we look forward to that.
And anyone can come along to that, I believe.
Yeah. Now, you're also pursuing your qualification to become an accredited guide. How's that coming along?
That's almost there in terms of bronze accreditation. So
yeah, and about Gilbert Joe May.
Yep, we're doing the Road to Freedom in June, 8th of June, I think it is, off the top of my head. But there'll be some publicity around that, so that's looking at.
Yeah, but we'll give a heads up to that on this program for sure. And I myself am a silver accredited guide. You can go to my website www.guernseywalkingtours.com. It's the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Guernsey, or the Channel Islands, this year. And if anybody that's listening is planning to come to Guernsey, we would love to meet up with you, wouldn't we, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely.
And show you around. And so please do not hesitate to get hold of us at occupied@gnetradio.com. So I think that's a wrap. We've gone over the hour very, very slightly.
Yeah, but by the time I've edited it a little bit, it'll probably be on the money.
And we look forward to May 1942. And as I say, if you've got anything to tell us, anything to ask us, occupied@gnetradio.com. And I think that's all from me.
Yeah, that's us done. There'll be another special. I just thought I haven't plugged this. There'll be another special out as well, which I recorded with Simon Delarue.
Oh, yes. Good, a good friend of the programme. Yep.
He's set himself an enormous task of writing 80 articles in the run-up to through the 80 days in the run-up to liberation. So
Yeah, that reminds me, I've got a deadline to write an article for him myself. Okay, listen, we've got to go. We're going to hand you over to Jim Delridge and his wonderful song, 5 to 7. So it's Ala Pashoin from me.
And cheerio from me.
Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone, left on a ship 'cause they knew what was to come.